This is Money Made Simple, the financial podcast that keeps it simple and gets to the point.
Kia ora and welcome back to Money Made Simple, brought to you by Simplicity. Today I am thankfully welcoming Jennie back because it's been years and years since I've had her on the podcast with me.
I think it's been about a month, Liv, but hi.
What a long month it's been though.
So hard for you.
Yeah, no, it was lovely talking to Matt. But anyway, let's move on to today. So today we're tackling a topic that we think is pretty crucial for any Kiwi to understand and plan for, right?
Yes, especially at the moment, given the current economic climate.
That taboo subject, not a great time at the moment. But yeah, we're talking about setting up your rainy day fund. Let's start with the basics. What is a rainy day fund and why is it so essential?
Yeah, so a rainy day fund is pretty simple. Maybe calling it an emergency fund makes it a bit more obvious.
Yeah, because you're not just going to use it on a rainy day,
No,
right?
it might be sunny when an emergency happens.
Might be.
So basically, it's just money set aside for unforeseen expenses. It might be a medical emergency, a sudden job loss.
Quite a thing right now, right?
Absolutely. Urgent home repairs, a car breaking down. It's basically
Something happening to your cat
or
or your dog or your child, right?
Why are you trying to hurt all the things that I love? Yes, or something happening to someone in your family or a pet. It's
No,
basically...
your pet is your family, right?
Did I say or?
Yes.
Sorry.
My cat's
Something
my
happening
family.
to someone in your family. It's a financial safety net in case something bad happens.
And let's just remember, it's not actually just about having those funds, so the practical aspect. It's also about reducing the stress that you would have not having the funds, so you then have the freedom to handle all these surprises or emergencies without getting into debt. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Having this fund is not just going to affect you when something bad happens. It's going to give you peace of mind
Yes.
all the time.
Yes.
Even when things are going well, you know that you have this safety net there.
Yeah. And so with everything going on in the world, pandemics and floods and all sorts, having that safety net, I think, is more important than ever, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So do you have an emergency fund?
I knew you were going to ask me that. I do have a little rainy day fund.
A little one.
Yeah,
Just a cute little thing.
Yeah, I didn't used to have anything, and now I have something.
Okay, well, that's good.
What about you, Liv?
I will discuss this a bit later, but I do, but it's in a little bit of a different format. So I have a big mortgage, like a lot of us do at the moment, and I use my mortgage structure to have that money available. And yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, we know what a rainy day fund or an emergency fund is and why we need it. So I guess the next important thing is, how do we start building this fund? What are the first steps to getting started?
Okay, so before all else, it's probably a good idea to determine how much you need. A rule of thumb that seems to be quite often discussed on the blogs and guides is to save about 3 to 6 months worth of basic living expenses. So that really sets you up for stuff like redundancy in the kind of market that we're seeing now, or long-term illness if you can't work for several months or more. The kind of more rare but serious issues that can mean you can't bring in an income for any period of time. So if you're going to work towards your 3 to 6 month lump, you need to calculate your essential average monthly expenses. Cool?
Okay. Yeah.
And so when we say essentials, we mean stuff like rent or mortgage, your basic food shop, so not the lovely extravagant stuff that you might often do. So don't include alcohol in that.
Yep. Or eating out,
Yeah,
takeaways,
exactly.
that kind of thing.
Yep. The bills that you have coming out on a regular basis, maybe insurance.
But again, with bills, maybe you're stripping out Spotify or
Exactly.
Netflix, that kind of thing.
Essential bills, like your power. You can't just be like, oh, I won't have power for 3 to 6 months.
So what would your life look like over those months if you were just covering the basics of life?
Yeah. So don't include the fun stuff. And this would be a rough average. You're not going to calculate this to the dollar. But once you've got that monthly cost, you then multiply that by the number of months that you would ideally like your fund to cover.
3 to 6 months worth of expenses sounds like
Daunting, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. The other way that you could look at it, I guess, another way to calculate that number would be to think about the types of emergencies that might come up for you and sort of put a price on that. So I'm thinking, thinking about your life, and if you've got lots of cats and you don't...
No, you've got two
You
too.
wish you had lots
Yes,
of cats.
I do.
If you don't have pet insurance, and so you think a vet bill might be a potential emergency expense
Definitely
for you.
would.
If you've got a slightly unreliable car and you think
That
there
blew
might
up.
be, there might be the chance that you need to replace that car, or that's another way to look at it, is what are the emergencies that I'm most likely to face and how can I save up enough money to cover myself?
And you wouldn't want to just have that emergency fund number that you decide on if you're calculating it this way, only cover one emergency, because you could have several things happening.
Yeah, but maybe that's a place to start. Yeah. Maybe you start by thinking, what is the most likely thing that's going to come up in my life? And then you work towards 3 months worth of expenses. You don't. Yeah.
Step by step. Love it.
And we totally know that everyone's situation is different. You're going to have to tailor your emergency fund to your personal circumstances. Yeah. And I was just thinking, for example, if you did lose your job, then there's a few other things to think about. Like if you have a partner and they're still working, then that might be more of a case of how long can we live on one income.
True.
You might not need an emergency fund for that particular situation.
Yeah. Your partner might be able to cover that basic 1 month of expenses that you talked about. Ours wouldn't be able to cover our mortgage with only one of us, so we have to have that emergency fund as the backstop. But you might have lower cost per month, but you need to calculate it at the start, right?
Yeah, so it's absolutely a personal situation.
Another would be if you have some really lovely and quite well-off parents who might be able to act as a backstop a little bit more for some rather than others, right?
Yeah, or you don't have to pay rent for a couple of months because you can live in the spare room for that period of time. And
exactly. But so everyone, as we said, is different, and it can be a little bit overwhelming to decide how much you need and what your personal circumstances are. But just pick one way and stick with it, because the worst you can do is to put your head in the sand. Lots of people just don't think they have enough or that they will ever have enough to get started, which is a real problem. You don't want not having enough to stop you from building it.
So starting small, starting with just say your initial goal is I want to have $500 or $1,000 in an account. That's a good place to start.
Gets you on the wagon.
Yeah, and in terms of initial setup, what that looks like, I think it's really important that you want to keep this money separate from your everyday expenses.
Yes.
So it can't get tangled up.
Don't just think I have enough and I can cover it.
So you have it in a separate account, but it needs to be accessible. So it's kind of this balancing act. You need to be able to get to that money easily. It can't be wrapped up in an investment fund or in your property, say. It needs to be in an account that you can get to within a sort of 24-hour period. But you don't want it to be too accessible that you might be tempted to tap into it for
Yes, you don't want to necessarily have a tap and go card or on your Apple Pay that you, oopsies.
Exactly. So it's accessible but not too accessible.
Yes.
The Barefoot Investor, who we reference.
We think are great. I think we've referenced them quite a bit.
He says you need to clearly name and state that this is your emergency fund. It's not a savings account.
Or a spending account.
You're only going to dip into this money when you really need it.
And we'll link in the show notes because the guy that wrote that book, Scott Pape, I think it is.
Yeah, that's right.
He's great. So there are several options for where to keep your emergency fund. That could be from high interest savings accounts that you can still access within a couple of days to a simple separate checking account like your everyday spending account, obviously not actually for spending.
Yeah, and there are a few other options I think worth talking about. If you're looking over the longer term as you build this fund, maybe you're a really lucky person and an emergency doesn't come up in your life for years.
That's me.
Like you might want to get that money working for you, not just sitting in a bank account.
Yeah. For example, you could put some of that emergency fund into an investment fund. So you're at least keeping up with inflation. Maybe you're getting some returns on top of that.
Yeah, maybe if you reach that amazing goal of 6 months of expenses saved, maybe you want to keep 2 or 3 months readily available and then you put the rest of those savings into an investment account.
Yeah, so some kind of investment so that keeps that money or stops inflation from really eating away at it, right?
Yeah, sure.
But you've got to be careful here as well, kind of caveat that, investments, regardless of what kind of investment, all have risk associated and they can obviously go up and down. So you might not want to look at high-risk investments for money that you might need to get out at a particular time that you didn't choose that timing.
Yeah. There's another way that I know you're keen to talk about where you can get that money working a little bit harder for you in the meantime, and that's the way you manage your emergency fund via your mortgage, right?
Yeah. So, for example, we bank with BNZ. We have our mortgage with them, and I have our emergency fund because I deal with all the finances in our household. We have it as our offset account, and we've briefly touched on this in our mortgages episode. But basically, for us, it's $50,000 as one of our loans is a floating rate that then has offset accounts flowing into it.
Right.
And so we say it starts with 50K in debt. We then fill it up during the year. Whenever we get paid, that goes into an offset account. And whatever money we have saved in that offset account, that stops us paying the interest on that portion of the mortgage. So say we have a 50K offset and 10K of it is filled up from our last couple of months of salary. That means we only pay interest on 40K of that part of the mortgage. So I would always have at least 10K in that offset in order to make sure that we have that emergency fund.
That's kind of another way, rather than investing some of your emergency fund, that's getting your emergency fund to work for you, right?
Yeah, exactly. Always love to do that. But it's just, not everyone owns a house or can set up their mortgage that way. So it's just
and do
another
all
way.
banks have that product available?
Well, interestingly, we used to bank with and have our mortgage with ANZ because it's good to jump around depending on how it will best work for you. So ANZ had a product which was similar but different called revolving credit.
So if you do have a mortgage and you don't have this set up, it might be worth talking to your bank.
Yeah.
Okay, so investing a portion or offsetting your mortgage are two ways you could get your rainy day fund working for you while you don't actually have an emergency to deal with. And part of this is trying to future-proof that money. So, you don't put the money aside in a basic bank account and then it's sat there for 10 years and at that point it's actually worth a lot less than it was initially.
Exactly. And on that note, with now versus in 10 years' time, I think it's worth reviewing your emergency fund as time goes on and adjusting the amount as your financial situation or your personal situation changes. So say you didn't have kids now and then you have kids, or you get more pets because you always add to your pet bundle, don't you?
I think it'd be a goldfish next.
Yes. Or you get into a long-term relationship or get married and there's two people to consider and work together on budgeting.
Yeah, or two
like we
incomes coming into a family.
Exactly. So keep checking in and, every just couple of years, like we talked about with wills, you make sure you check in where you are and what you need, whether your circumstances have changed.
Setting up a rainy day fund is actually golden rule number 7 in the Money Made Simple book.
Mm-hmm. Which we'll link to again in the show notes.
Yes. So, that book is looking at lots of different parts of our lives and how we can set that up to feel financially secure. So if we've got some high interest debt, or we've got some credit card debt or consumer debt, would you say it's more important to prioritise starting this emergency fund or paying off that debt?
So I would say go pay off debt just because of the snowball effect of compounding debt. So we've talked in the past about compounding returns, and so money makes money makes money. Debt is the opposite. Money incurs
costs, which incur
costs, which incur costs. It's not nearly as easy to say. But I think that you pay off your debt as in how you can, and then as soon as you've paid off that debt, you're going to start building that emergency fund. And remember, it's not one moment in time. This is something that you can build, and that in turn will eventually, hopefully, stop you from having to get into high interest debt at any point.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point of a rainy day fund, right?
It's a safety net.
Yeah, because if you need to access credit quickly, it's often going to cost you money.
Yes.
So if you have that rainy day fund set up, okay, so, I'm always listening to other podcasts and reading blogs and books, and there seems to be a few different opinions about this, but I think that makes sense because that high interest debt can also incur penalties on top of the kind of compounding interest.
Nature.
So this is something you have your order of priorities in terms of your financial well-being, and we'll get rid of that debt first.
Yeah. Cool. Another thing is that you could consider automating the build-up of your emergency funds. So say automatically each week or month or however often you get paid, and having an auto payment or direct debit straight out to your emergency fund wherever you have decided to keep it. So that means you don't even see it. So it's kind of like that old adage of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah. And like we've said a couple of times, like starting small is a perfectly legitimate way to start. So even if, you can put aside a couple of $100 to start with, and then you set up an automatic payment from there where you've got $10 or $20 a week going into this fund, those numbers will start to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And bonus points if you're putting them into some kind of interest-bearing savings account rather than just having it sitting there not
doing anything,
growing its own interest. Yeah. Okay. So I think let's wrap it up there.
All right then.
Yeah. Cool.
So we've covered what an emergency fund or a rainy day fund is and why it's super important to have one.
Mm-hmm. So it is your safety net for the unexpected.
And that can take a few formats that can look different for everybody.
Yeah, and make it work for you. As with all finances, it's personal.
And it's much better to start small than not start at all.
Yeah.
So even if you don't feel like you can suddenly set a few $1,000s aside, like start wherever you're at.
Yep. And from there, there's a couple of ways that you can work out what you want that fund eventually to look like. So how much you would like it to either cover or be in terms of the 3 to 6 month type thing.
Yeah. And that's a really personal thing depending on all those circumstances that we've covered before.
Yep. And finally, there are options in how to hold the funds from savings accounts to different types of mortgages. So again, work out what works for you.
Yeah, and we've mentioned a few different resources today. I don't think we've mentioned Sorted, which is making me feel weird.
But
because
let's mention it now then.
Yes, okay. So I think their savings calculator here would be really useful. So either to look at, if I put this much aside every week, where would I be at it in a year or 2 years or 3 years? Or you can set a savings goal for yourself. So once you've worked out what you might want that fund to look like, you pop that number in and then work backwards. So what would that cost me on a weekly or monthly basis to build up?
How much shall I direct debit from my pay into that?
So you can start either way. You can start with what you can afford on a weekly basis, or you can start with what you're aiming for. And so, yeah, I think that's the Sorted savings calculator.
We love Sorted, don't we?
We really do.
They should pay us. It's the government, isn't it? They shouldn't pay us.
They're not going to pay us.
No. Anyway, so what's coming up next time?
Next time we're going to be doing hopefully a really useful, practical session, some tips and tricks for helping to tackle the cost of living crisis that so many of us are experiencing right now in many different ways. So yeah, this will be a really
positive action focused.
Yes, it's the opposite of a rainy day fund. It's a
sunny day future.
Bringing some sunshine
awesome
into your life.
All right, well, we will catch you next time, and thanks for tuning in, and thank you for coming back to me, Jenny.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here, Liv.
See ya. This podcast contains personal opinions and is intended to provide educational information only. It doesn't relate to your particular financial situation or goals and is not financial advice or recommendations. Simplicity New Zealand Limited is the issuer of the Simplicity KiwiSaver scheme and investment funds. For product disclosure statements, please visit Simplicity's website, simplicity.kiwi.